Everybody, how's it going? Pretty good? Pretty good? What trouble with the swiveling today? That's hard. Back. We're all aware that today is election day?
Yeah.
Everybody vote already?
Yes. Not yet.
Not yet? All right. I guess I'll leave that up there. Come on in. Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics. We're going to talk a little bit about book 2 some more. This swivel's not really working. I got to make sure that it gets me no matter where I walk. We're going to talk a little bit more about what's going on in book 2. We're going to follow up with what's going on in book 3. So let's start with where we ended off last time. We were talking about the doctrine of the mean, right?
Yes.
If I'm not mistaken, it was kind of, it was almost like a little bit tragic. Everybody was kind of getting excited just as like the class was ending, and they're like, oh yeah, this is a really cool idea. We talked about 2 major virtues and the way that the doctrine of the mean handles them. What were they? Fear and desire aren't the virtues, but you're right that the virtues have to do with fear and desire. So what are the virtues? Temperance is one, yeah. And courage is the other. And Cher was saying fear and desire. Which of these is about fear and which is about desire?
Fear, courage, desire, temperance.
Yeah, courage is it's the virtue. It's about fear. Or that's certainly one way of understanding what courage is. To say like courage is the virtue that's about fear. It has to do with the mean with respect to fear. Temperance is the virtue with respect to desire. Somebody explain what's the whole doctrine of the mean part? These are the virtues. They're what?
You say they're in between the 2 extremes?
Yeah, in between 2 extremes. And since temperance is about desire, what are our extreme forms of desire? What are extreme forms of anything?
Vice and vice.
Yeah, it's vice and vice, right? They're 2 vices, 2 different extreme vices. How do I know the difference between the 2 extreme vices? Why aren't they the same thing? How come I don't have virtue just opposed to 1 vice? Why is it opposed to 2? Yeah. That's right, yeah. So when we say it's a mean between 2 extremes, and the extremes are, we have a deficient extreme and an excessive extreme. And by definition, anything that's deficient or excessive is like not good, right? Or not good enough. To say that I don't have enough of something is to say like, yeah, we're missing the mark. Say I have too much of something is again, say, you've missed the mark, you've gone too far. With temperance, too much desire? That seems plausible as a vice. What are the names of this vice? Maybe there's more than one. What I?
Gluttony.
Gluttony, yeah, sure. Gluttony is one. Anything else? Gluttony is too much desire with respect to food. Yeah. So what about other things? We have
Greed.
too much desire. Sloth doesn't seem like excessive desire.
Greed.
Necessarily greed, yeah. It's about money. Anything else? Lust. Yeah. And I think, as I mentioned last time, like it almost seems like we're just going down the list of deadly sins here that all have to do with a failure of temperance to have too much desire about something. Yes. Yeah, that is. Is envy about too much desire?
It's being jealous of someone else.
Yeah.
Hating a person for having.
This exposes something that maybe is a little bit of a. It exposes a little bit of a shortcoming in this doctrine of the mean, or at least it articulates a way in which the doctrine of the mean doesn't completely capture what's going on in Aristotle's virtue ethics here. He's giving us a lens to look through it, and it's extremely instructive. It's very, very helpful. But maybe the problem with envy is not that you desire too much or that you have too little control over your desires, although that certainly seems to be perhaps part of it. But what marks envy as a particular kind of vice might be that you desire the wrong things, right? You desire things that are not yours. So this is interesting because it's not necessarily about like too much or too little. It's about, and Aristotle will end up saying this in a couple of different ways in a couple of different places, but we want to say something like it's the right, a virtuous action at least, and we'll make this transition here to talking about a virtuous action. A virtuous action is the right action at the right time, with respect to the right object, and with the right feeling. And we can maybe even tack on more to this. It's like it's right in every single respect. One of the things that Aristotle is offering here is like really thickening up the concept of a right action or a moral action, right? That it's not just the action itself, it's all of these other things that come along with it. And with the right feeling certainly gets at a lot of what's going on in this doctrine of the mean. And maybe that's enough to help us kind of triangulate the virtues, at least situate them as a mean between two extremes. But yeah, it's an interesting point about envy here. That maybe the problem with envy isn't that it's too much desire or too little desire, it's desiring the wrong things. And this is something that came up in Meno as well. When Socrates and Meno were talking, and Meno says, what is virtue? It's, what was his fourth definition? How sharp are you guys? Do you remember Meno's fourth definition? It's a two-parter. To desire.
Beneficial.
To desire beautiful things and have the power to acquire them. And Socrates says, like, yeah, but what do you mean beautiful things? Do you mean like beneficial things? And we have this kind of, we've exposed this question that if Meno was sharper, he might have picked up on it. Said like, yeah, that's a really big part of virtue, is being able to discriminate between the things that are actually beneficial and the things that are not beneficial. So that failure of discrimination can also lead us to like problems with temperance, for example. If there are things that I believe to be beneficial, but they're not actually beneficial, and I desire them. Perhaps I desire them too much. I've kind of strayed into problems with temperance. So yeah, maybe envy goes somewhere over here, but maybe it gets an asterisk too, and suggests that like maybe the problem with envy isn't a too much desire. Maybe it's about wrong things. Deficient extreme with respect to temperance? Comparatively fewer words about this. We don't use, and perhaps it's because we don't encounter it as often. You won't find too many deadly sins about having deficient desire, but maybe we got some leads, yeah. Apathy, yeah. Seems like the problem with this is it's a person who's apathetic. Anything else?
That would be
Rest.
Maybe sloth comes in here, yeah. Anything else? I think at our last meeting somebody mentioned that like this seems like a pretty good description. A deficiency of desire seems like a decent description of maybe clinical depression. Might be part of what's going on over here. And especially as soon as we identify clinical depression as like maybe a version of what's going on here with a deficiency with respect to desire, suddenly it becomes clear, right? That like that's not a good life. A life completely bereft of any kind of desire or pleasure at all is not going to be a good life. Pleasure is a good thing. If it gets out of hand, right? If you lose control over it, you can become a slave to it, and that's a really big problem. To not have any desire at all is no kind of life. Desire is what gets you it gets you up in the morning, it gets you out of bed, right? Gets you like out of the house and meeting people, perhaps. Without desire, we might have like serious questions about whether we'll ever have the motivation to actually do anything at all. Yeah.
This one's probably winging it, but fear fall into that category?
Would,
To be fearful of something, wouldn't that harm your motivation to actually do it?
in which case, what we would see here is fear and desire are getting kind of mixed up in one another, right?
Yeah.
That we might have something that's a little bit more complex. And again, it might be the case that fear and desire never actually do come apart. Maybe all desire is always kind of tangled up in fear, right? Any desire I can talk about as I don't know, a fear of not satisfying the desire. There's the last cupcake on the counter, and you're like, oh, I desire that cupcake. And would you also say that you fear that you won't get to eat the cupcake? Yeah, maybe. Maybe there are two different ways of looking at the same thing. Separable in thought, perhaps. Maybe not with respect to being. Yeah, sure. But the separation in thought can be instructive. It can be the sort of thing where like you kind of zero in on like, what's going wrong? I feel like I'm missing the mark here. Why am I missing the mark? What's driving my mistake? Could be a problem with desire. Could be a problem with fear. And we talked about this one too. My excessive fear vice is, what do we call it? Oh yeah, this one's easy.
Oh, reckless.
Too much fear is, yeah, cowardice. Yeah, the deficiency
Is reckless.
with respect to fear is recklessness, yeah. And these are my two master virtues, especially if I think back in terms of what it was that Aristotle had to say about the animal soul, right? And this is the part of the irrational soul that moral virtue is concerned with, and mostly with the animal soul, right? With this part of us that fears and desires. And these are things that get us to pursue or avoid things in our environment. And this is what moves us, right? This is seemingly one of the most intelligent parts of the animal soul, is this ability to perceive our surroundings and evaluate them as objects of fear or objects of desire. And this is maybe where we want moral virtue to focus. We want to bring our rational soul to bear on those things to make it so that I'm fearing the right things with the right amount, at the right time, with the right feelings, right? Or I'm desiring things, the right things, and I act on it at the right time, with respect to the right sorts of objects, with the right feeling, etc., etc., etc. So these might be the two virtues, the only two virtues that I need, right? One that describes my attraction to things, one that describes my repulsion to things. But I can bring this doctrine of the mean to bear on just about any virtue. Anything that I think about is like, that's a good characteristic, that's a good quality for everybody to have. I can bring my doctrine of the mean to bear on just about anything. I've had arguments with fellow philosopher friends where they're just kind of like, you can't do this with everything. And I'm like, yeah, watch me. I think I can do it with everything. But let's try it out with a couple of things. Let's try something like, is it important to be an honest person? Would we say that everybody needs to be honest in order to be excellent? Any person that's not honest, well, we can imagine a version of them that was equally successful, and on top of that, they were honest. We'd be like, yeah, that would be, the honest one would be better. Do children need to be honest?
Yeah.
Do adults need to be honest?
Mm-hmm.
Do slaves and masters and soldiers and teachers? Like, everybody needs to be honest, right? There's some kind of form. But if it's a virtue, then it's a mean between extremes. One of those extremes is going to be easy to identify. The other one may be a little bit harder. What's honesty about? Honesty is a virtue with respect to?
Truth.
The truth, yeah. It's about telling the truth. What do you call it when you're deficient in telling the truth?
A liar.
That's a liar. That's the easy one, right? Someone like this is a liar. If we wanted to get... A liar is the person. If we wanted to describe the character of the liar, I don't know, maybe we would say something like mendacity is the vice, or something like that. Any of the various GRE words for people who lie. There are so many. If you ever find yourself studying for the GRE and you're brushing up on vocabulary, you'll notice there are so many words for being morally bad. A whole panoply of them. So yeah, being a liar, that's deficient with respect to telling the truth. Is there a vice that's associated with telling the truth too much?
Yes.
Blunt. Too blunt.
Being blunt.
But although you can be a butt in many ways, not just with respect to telling the truth. But what do we have here?
Too
Bluntness?
Blunt, yeah.
Yeah, bluntness is a problem with telling the truth maybe too much or in the wrong way, right? Yeah. Yeah. Maybe tactlessness is another way of kind of you told the truth, but you still didn't quite get it right. Maybe the right thing there was to just kind of keep your mouth shut. Kind of tap into this idea that not every truth is a truth worth sharing, right? Will?
I
like recuse yourself from like the responsibility of whatever like the effect of like telling like absolute truth is, because I was just being honest. So it's like a way to like recuse yourself of the responsibility.
Right, yeah, so this is the, yeah, as long as I'm telling the
Yeah.
truth, I can pretend like it's a defense, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes people say this about, bragging, being braggadocious. Sometimes people will say, like, it ain't bragging if you done it. And you're like, yeah, but no, maybe it is sometimes. Even if you've done it, even if it's the truth. The truth isn't always a defense. And you're like, yeah, I'm just being honest. We might say, like, I don't think so. Honesty is a virtue. It's a mean between two extremes. Merely telling the truth doesn't prove that you are being honest. We know that if you were not telling the truth when the truth needed to be told, maybe that puts you in this deficient vice. But there's an excessive vice as well. Anybody who's ever spent appreciable amount of time with a small child in public is probably fairly aware of like how this can totally be a vice, right? The kid will be like, hey, look, that person's really ugly. And you're just like, oosh, oosh. And they're like, what? They are. And you're like, like, yes, but that's not the point. Gossip. That's another one. Just because gossip is true doesn't mean it's worth repeating. Being honest is telling the truth. At the right time, with respect to the right objects, with the right feeling, in fact, too, right? So this is interesting. And notice what we described here in this kind of excess of telling the truth. At no point did we ever suggest that, like, you should lie. This is like a big open question, I think, for virtue ethics. It's like, is there a time to lie? Is there a right amount of lying, right? Or would we say, like, this is a virtue with respect to truth-telling, and the excesses have to do with times that you should maybe just shut up and not say anything at all, rather than lying. But there are all kinds of like interesting thought experiments where we can, mostly having to do with things like the SS knocking on your door and asking if like, is Anne Frank in the attic? And she is. She's totally in the attic.
Should definitely lie.
Like, wondering, like, should I tell them? Yeah, Carrie.
Well, I mean, there is a difference between like lying and hiding the truth.
Yeah, yeah, and I think we can, when we start thinking about like what's driving this, right? Is it, am I hiding the truth in a good way? Am I hiding the truth? That's kind of a thing too, right? There is a difference between lying and hiding the truth, but maybe it's a distinction without like an important moral difference. If you're trying to hide the truth, that might be a problem. And there might be a difference between hiding the truth and just not volunteering it, right? Maybe a difference between like, so like there's the truth, it's right out there for everybody to see. Did I try to conceal it? Or did I just not be like, hey, everybody, look, there's the truth? Is there a difference there? It's maybe an omission-commission distinction. And it seems like it makes a difference with respect to like how we're thinking about this virtue of honesty. Yeah, Stan.
That's actually part of hypothesis theory. Like if you have a hypothesis and the evidence doesn't support the hypothesis, but like there's a hypothesis and the alternative to the hypothesis. The evidence not supporting the hypothesis doesn't suggest the alternative. It merely fails to suggest the hypothesis. So it's like you can tell the truth or you can not tell the truth, or fail to tell the truth.
Yeah, those are my two options.
The truth is not lying.
Is not the same thing as lying. Although there are some versions of failing to tell the truth that are lying, right?
Sure.
Just not all of them.
But not all failing to tell the truth
Is lying.
all.
Yeah, that's right. Which is why, like, yeah, why we have a Fifth Amendment, right? You can just like say, like, I don't want to answer that. You go, oh, you're lying. You're like, no, I'm just not saying anything at all. George, yeah.
Shaming fall into the category of being truthful.
What was that?
Shaming.
Shaming. Does shame? Oh, shame is fascinating. Let's get to that in just a second. Shame, possibly the most interesting of the virtues, if we want to call it that. This is like the issue. Like, maybe shame is a virtue. Oh, maybe shame isn't a virtue. We can stack a couple more on this. I just kind of want to like give us a sense of how this works. So, honesty. Let's do charity. People talk about charity as a virtue. Charity is about what?
Helping others.
It's about helping others. Yeah, it's about, if we
Like
wanted to
giving
like make
to
it's
others.
about giving, right? Charity is about giving. Can you give too little?
Yes.
Do we have words for this?
Selfish.
Yeah,
Selfish.
greedy. Oh, that was interesting. It was up there with Oh, I was up there with desire. Do I give too little because I desire it and I don't want to part with it? Oh, there's a connection maybe between
Stingy.
yeah, greedy, stingy, miserly. Yeah, all of these sorts of words. Excessive vice? We got names for that? People who give too much? Interesting that it's harder to come up with those words, right?
Word exists.
Altruistic.
What is it? Well, altruistic isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? That's the thing about our vices, is they always kind of capture the idea that it's an excess or a deficiency and it's bad. Right?
Self-sacrifice.
Again, is that necessarily bad?
It's like foolish.
You don't
Foolish,
care.
yeah. What is it, before we get into like what the right words for this might be, what does it tell us that like we have trouble coming up with this word?
We-
Yeah, we hardly ever see it. Like most people, like whatever the meme for charity is, most people are over here. Hardly ever do we find like, oh, we got a problem with people doing too much charity. No such thing. Charity is a virtue. You don't have too much of it. But too much giving. Any more volunteers for like words for this? They might, yeah.
I don't know. It's not necessarily too much given, but with respect to the rights of an object and all that, like being gaudy or something like that.
Being gaudy, yeah, being ostentatious. Aristotle totally gets into this. He makes a difference between ostentatious. Yeah, somebody who's like way too showy in the way that they give. There's a kind of an excess with respect to giving. You could be what's known as dissolute or profligate. These are other like words that maybe you don't encounter every day, mostly because we have so few occasions to talk about somebody who gives too much. Yeah.
If a person is considered too charitable, would that affect the people around them to think would that make the people envy that person because he or she's too charitable?
I don't know if that would be the problem. I can think of at least two problems with excesses in giving. One would be you give so much that now like you yourself become a charity case, right? That you just don't really, some amount of taking care of yourself is required, even if we think that like what your goal is to take care of other people. You're going to be at your best and most effective in helping other people if you can kind of keep your own shit together. If you give so much that you just have no more resources, it's kind of like, all right, so what now? You've helped those people, what comes next? And you're like, I got nothing left to give. And we're like, you maybe should have been a little more strategic with your giving. We can also think of it in terms of like, I give things to people that they don't really need. Maybe because I want it to be showy or ostentatious or gaudy, right? That I'm giving, but it's not really all that helpful. In which case I might be giving for the wrong reasons, or I might be giving at the wrong time, or I might be giving the wrong object to the wrong person, or I might be doing it without having the right feeling, and this is a big one for charity, right? It's not charity if you don't have the right feeling. If it's not done with an open heart, right? Charity given under duress. I don't know if we want to call that charity.
People who give the big sums of money, like so they can write it off on their taxes, not really because.
Yeah, if I did it to write it off on my taxes, wasn't done with the right feeling, wasn't done for the right reason. Anger's a thing that you feel. Can you have too much or too little of it? Sure. Why not? What's the excess?
Rage.
Yeah, wrath, rage. We all know this, right? People who are hot-tempered, who can't like control their anger, they have too much anger and too little control over it. There's such a thing as having too little anger.
Nice. Too nice.
Too nice. But yeah, what is this thing that is too nice? Yeah, what was the word? Mild. Yeah, it's so funny because mild is the word that Aristotle picks for the virtue. Obviously not mild, but he gets translated as mild. The virtue is mildness or gentleness, and you could be too angry, too rageful. But then the other side of this is like, yeah, maybe, I don't know, what do you want to call it? Meekness? But then again, I thought they were going to inherit the earth. What's going on here? Is there a good time to be angry? Aristotle totally says yes, and you can miss it. You can be like the person who, like, the opportunity for righteous anger presents itself, and you're just like, well, let's not. Honestly, this is something that like I myself have struggled with, and other people have talked to me about it. Like I'll be driving along and somebody cuts me off, and I'm just like, oh. And the person in the passenger seat is like, honk your horn, let them know that they were being a jerk. And I'm just like, what does that accomplish? Maybe there's a time to get angry,
Yes.
and maybe some of us miss this, right? Okay, we get the idea how this works.
Mm-hmm.
It's a really instructive little mechanism. It doesn't capture virtue ethics in its entirety, but it definitely starts to like get us thinking in terms of means between two extremes. Suddenly we're kind of duplicating vices in a way that like maybe we're accustomed to thinking, even if we're thinking about like virtues and vices within the Catholic tradition, 7 deadly sins, 7 virtues, they pair up in like, we're accustomed to thinking of these things as one virtue, one opposite vice. Aristotle is saying like, no, it's one virtue, 2 opposite vices, an excessive one and a deficient one. Do you think there's any controversy over whether or not these things are good things? Mildness with respect to anger? Friendliness, maybe? Is friendliness something that we would consider to be a virtue? If you're not friendly, it's just not a full life. We can imagine somebody who accomplishes the same things that you would, but on top of that, they're a friendlier person. And we're like, yeah, the friendlier person's doing it better. Are any of these controversial? Maybe the question of where the mean gets put is a little bit controversial, but it seems as if the virtues themselves, the character traits in question, are seemingly uncontroversial. They're seemingly these things that we would say like, yeah, everybody needs those. When we think of an example, when we think of the target, where the hell is the eraser? When we think of the target for excellence, for human excellence and for flourishing, do we all picture the same thing? A temperate person, a courageous person, an honest person, a friendly person, a gentle person, a charitable person. These are all like, do we imagine like everybody is like, yep, that's a good person? Anybody here disagree? Interesting, yeah. On what point?
The basis of the argument.
Which is, help me out, what's the basis of the
That
argument?
people can agree on what a good person is.
Oh, yeah. Well, at least in the abstract, can we agree that a good person is temperate, courageous, honest, charitable, friendly, gentle, all of those things?
I mean,
That maybe there'd be
I
disagree.
agree, but I can understand the grounds on which someone might disagree.
Is there one of these in particular that you're thinking that somebody might think to themselves like, no, courage, that's it, like, nobody should be courageous, people should be reckless instead? Or they should be cowardly instead? There might be some disagreement about just what counts as courage, but is courage the target? We like, I know that we all have like this tendency, and maybe it's a good one, that we've kind of grown up to be kind of like open-minded and tolerant, to be like, well, other people might disagree and have different ideas. I'm not sure, like, could you disagree about whether or not courage is a good idea? You might disagree about what counts as courage. But if the alternatives are cowardice and recklessness, can you imagine anybody saying anything other than courage being the ideal? Yeah, Benjamin.
Is that like a necessary condition for being a good person? Because if it's like, if that's required for being a good person, let's say anyone is, because everyone's always kind of like.
Everybody's always missing it, right? Yeah, so we might end up saying that nobody gets it exactly right. No, there are no people. But still we have ideals, right? We have role models. Frequently this is how virtue ethics is talked about. I've seen in like intro to ethical theory type classes, a lot of times folks will do this kind of like virtue ethics. Hey, remember those like WWJD bracelets that people used to wear? That's like virtue ethics right there. You just like ask yourself like, what would the virtuous person do? And like have some idea of an exemplar for virtue. Maybe it's Jesus. Maybe it's Gandhi. Maybe it's Abigail Adams. Maybe it's Jane Addams. Probably better than Abigail Adams. Maybe it's Jane Addams. Maybe it's Martin Luther King Jr. Whoever your idea of like a virtuous person is, this idea of an exemplar, and that's a target. And maybe it's a whole kind of like a pastiche. Maybe it's a collage of many people. You have somebody in mind for temperance, somebody in mind for courage, somebody in mind for honesty. And you kind of put together like a Frankenstein's monster of a virtuous person in your head. Is this like part of like how your moral psychology works? Do you think to yourself in terms of role models and like do what that person would have done? Yeah, Will.
Well, I was saying something similar to him actually, because it's like the exclusivity. So I think that like, I would agree that like most people, if not all people, would agree like that would be a good person, but not only that would be a good person. Because if only that is a good person, then in order to be like an actual good person, you have to be the same person. Because these are all things that would like shape your personality absolutely. So everyone would end up being the exact same person, and that does not sound good to me.
Why doesn't that sound good?
I don't know. I feel like that. I at least have like. This
I don't necessarily disagree with this intuition. I encounter this an awful lot.
Like an individuality.
Yeah, folks will be like, yeah, but then there wouldn't be variation. And I'm just like, yeah, like no variation. Like, here's some great variation. Some people think murder's awesome. Some people think murder's awful. Let's get as many different viewpoints in our society as possible. Like, no. Let's get everybody to agree that like murder's bad. Maybe there are some things where like it would be good if we were actually all on the same page. Maybe not everything. But perhaps, yeah, if everybody were equally courageous, would we imagine like, life wouldn't be worth living anymore?
And wouldn't that go against like the main idea of the doctrine of being? Because it's all about not having like these absolutes, it's about finding the mean. And if everyone is the same thing, this absolute thing, that doesn't really seem to go with the whole message.
Well,
of this.
part of this might be that like, even if everybody's courageous, this doesn't mean that everybody's exactly the same. Because there are kind of like unavoidable differences in circumstance. So for example, and I don't know if we mentioned this in our last meeting, but like courage is like the same thing. It's the mean with respect to fear. It's the mean between recklessness and cowardice. But for a small child versus maybe for a soldier, courage looks very, very different. What counts as courage for the small child would not count as courage for the soldier, right? Or what counted as courage for the soldier would be reckless for the small child. Does that make sense?
But then it would just be the circumstances that are different, but the people would be exactly the same. Only the circumstances would change.
Well,
which is like an
but
external thing, right? So internally, which is what people are, like they're all the same person. It's only
their
external
character
things.
would be the same. Like we would say, like they all have virtuous character, and it's all the same virtue for like each person. But the way that the virtue expresses itself is different for each person because of their natural abilities, because of their contextual context, because of their context, the contextual sort of context. Is that enough variation that it's not like a big homogeneous world? That would be like, yeah, everybody's different because everybody's coming to virtue from a slightly different place?
I don't know, because I feel like that, like in that example of the soldier, well, he was a kid. Oh yeah, I made that exact same decision, and when I was in those circumstances. But now
Yeah,
I'm
but like there's naturally enough variation that we're going to say like no two people are going to encounter exactly the same circumstances in their lives. They might develop their character to kind of like aim at the same target. And in that sense, we'll have harmony. But there's enough natural variation in our lives that like nobody's going to encounter the exact same set of circumstances that somebody else will. Even two identical twins, right, are going to encounter slightly different circumstances and develop different personalities, right? They could both be exactly the same with respect to all these virtues, but still be distinguishable. Keep thinking about it. It's an interesting objection. Yeah.
Like, isn't it like when you were saying you're afraid of heights? So if you had to save a baby, you wouldn't reach over, or you'd be like too afraid to reach over. But someone who isn't afraid of heights, like that situation would be different for them because it's like a different thing that you're afraid of. So if they're afraid of like spiders and you're not afraid of spiders, like your courage would be different, like in different situations.
Yeah, perhaps. Or like my courage would be differently described, right? The feeling would be different. I think that there might be, we might say something like, as long as I'm still feeling intensely afraid of a non-dangerous heights type situation, or as long as somebody's feeling intensely afraid of some non-dangerous spider, we might say, like, it's not really courage for either person just yet. They're still kind of working on it. But yeah, you're right to identify this idea that the more fear that you feel, the different, that there's going to be like important differences in like how you approach the scary thing, right? Yeah, Giorgio.
Another thing you forgot to mention is like the timing of which like you're actually doing all these things. So if you have temperance, courage, honesty, and charity, and that makes you that would make you a good person, right? So
Make you a virtuous person, at least in those respects, yeah.
yeah. So if you don't have all those, like if you have some bouts where you don't experience courage, if you're cowardice, does that make you a bad person? Does that mean that like, oh, like if you're scared of spiders, are you a bad person because you're afraid of spiders? If you're not courageous?
You are not as good as you could be if you have an irrational fear of spiders. You know what would make you better? Not having that irrational fear of spiders. Now, I don't know if I'd go so far as to say you're a bad person, right? But you're missing the mark. Our idea of like a virtuous person, somebody who's like firing on all cylinders, right? Somebody who's getting it right in every single respect, does not have that problem. Whether we would call you a bad person or a good person might be, yeah, but I mean, it's certainly worth pointing out that this is one of the things that's going on. This is the transition that I'm trying to make here. That when we think about moral action in terms of exemplars, right? In terms of role models, for example, we might recognize that people do disagree about who the role models ought to be, right? There does seem to be, and there might be like some folks who are good contenders that we think you can get a lot of people to agree about, but even somebody like Jesus, I mean, goodness sakes, check out what Nietzsche has to say about Jesus. It's not complimentary. Basically, we get this picture of like, oh, this is somebody who's totally bought into a slave morality. Socrates too. He let Socrates have it just as hard. Like these are folks who like have been duped into thinking that like being gentle and being nonviolent is the way to go. That like they never quite realized that they needed to stand up and kind of like seize what was theirs. That they were too meek, too mild, and that this is exactly what the people in power wanted them to be. To kind of try to make suffering into a virtue, so that everyone was like, yeah, it's good to be like poor and downtrodden and all of those things, and to like not ever hurt anybody, and like all the people who are in power that want to keep those folks subdued are like, yeah, good, keep thinking that.
He's like he would be like for the Black Panther movement, for example.
Nietzsche? Hard to tell.
Instead of the like Martin.
Yeah, I think if we had to, if Nietzsche was reading like Martin and Malcolm and thinking to himself like, which way do I go here? I think he'd be more of a Malcolm fan. Yeah, for sure. But yeah, there's enough variation that we're kind of like, so what do we do with this? How is it that we think about these exemplars, about these role models, and what do we do about this problem where it seems like we're focused on the person, or we're focused on the character, but we're noticeably silent on this question of exactly what sort of character is the ideal character? Like, who is the best person? What is the best person like? We've kind of addressed this by saying like a temperate person, a courageous person, an honest person, a charitable person. But like, what exactly is temperance? What exactly is courage? Whoa, temperance, it's the mean with respect to like two extremes, an excessive one and a deficient one. Yeah, but where exactly is it? Can you give me some kind of prescriptive rule? Can you give me some kind of like abstract, can you give me the sort of thing that Socrates wants? Define temperance. That's the mean with respect to two extremes. Yes, but how will we know whether like we're on one side or whether we're on the other side or whether we've hit the target? Can you give me a proper logos, a definition that captures all and only temperate, all and only courageous, all and only honest, all and only virtuous acts? A lot of times when we're wondering, like, how is it that we ought to act? These are our moral questions. Like, what is it that we should be doing? The virtue ethicist responds, well, what would the virtuous person do? WWVPD, right? We'll all make up bracelets, like a nice Aristotelian bracelets. What would the virtuous person do? And think about, like, what's the relevant virtue here? Is it courage? Is it temperance? Is it friendliness? Is it honesty? What would the virtuous person do? But maybe that doesn't answer the question that I want, right? Maybe I'm not sure what the virtuous person would do. Maybe I'm stuck in like a genuine moral dilemma, and I'm just like, I'm not sure what the right thing to do is. And the virtue ethicist says, what would the virtuous person do? And you're like, I don't know. That's the problem. I have no idea what the virtuous person would do. This is a serious shortcoming in virtue ethics. It's a big criticism. Namely, doesn't give any prescriptive rules for what the right action is. And maybe that's what we want out of an ethical theory. Something that'll say, like, here are the rules. Here, like, when you're kind of encountering this kind of situation, here's what you do. This is what you should do. Then again, maybe a good response to this criticism would be to point out that, like, maybe this misses the point. Maybe virtue ethics just says, like, we actually don't care about prescriptive rules for action. We really are we're more concerned with character. More concerned with this question of, like, how is it that you become a good person, not what is it that you should do. They're related for sure. The two questions are totally related. For a variety of reasons. One of which has to do with the fact that all of these are habitual, right? So every time I act, I'm sedimenting habits. It's not just the action right now that's on the line when I'm trying to decide how it is that I ought to act, what it is that I should do. It's all of my future actions. If I act cowardly this time, sure, I've done the wrong thing. I've also made myself that much more likely to be cowardly the next time. It's going to be that much harder to be courageous the next time. Every time I act, my character is being shaped. Every action is an opportunity to develop character, or to, instead of developing character in a good way, right? Instead of developing virtue, I could be spoiling virtue. I could be perverting my soul. With every action, making it more difficult or less difficult to act well the next time. So yeah, maybe actions are secondary. Maybe character is primary. And this is the lens that we should be looking at it through. But there's maybe a deeper sort of response. So you can have two possible different responses to this. One is, you're missing the point. We just don't care about prescriptions for right actions. You're missing the point. Character is more fundamental. That if you develop the right character, you will do the right things. This is part of what it means to have the right character. You're predisposed to act in the right way. In which case, maybe we just have a difference of opinion about, like, what's important in an ethical theory between folks who would criticize virtue ethics for this reason and folks who would be like, no, I think they're focusing on exactly the right thing. Another part of this response would be to say that rules are, A, impossible. You're never going to get a good enough rule. And B, undesirable. Are these rules impossible? Well, this might come back to this thing. Yeah, this might come back to this thing that I was talking to Will about just a second ago, that, like, there is so much variation in the world. There's like, I can make rules about how to act that are kind of like, they account for all of the circumstances that I've experienced so far. But one thing that the Greeks were keenly aware of is that there's just so much variation in the world that anytime you try to make up rules where you're like, all right, this is how you should act, like tomorrow, some brand new thing's going to come along and it'll be like, we have no rule for this. Or our rule just failed to kind of consider that this was a possibility. Things are just so unexpectedly varied in the world that any attempt to try to come up with some kind of universal set of rules that prescribe how it is that people should act, that this just always falls short. And maybe it's like an interesting project to try to get our rules better and better and better. But we'll notice this with laws, right? Laws are kind of aiming at trying to capture moral truths, right? Trying to capture rules that are going to make us into good citizens and keep us all harmonious with one another. But they're always, like, they're never quite right, are they? They're always some kind of exceptional case where you're like, ugh, the law works most of the time, but like this brand new case that we've never seen before, I'm not sure how well that's going to work. There are frequent miscarriages of justice just because the rules don't quite get it right. They're right most of the time, but not every time. Yeah, Will.
I feel like that doesn't suggest that it's impossible, though. It's just that we haven't
Right.
found it.
Yeah, just that we haven't found it yet, right? So there's a certain pessimism about our ability to come up with certain kinds of prescriptive rules that apply in all cases, right? So maybe we're just saying like, oh, this is just not optimistic enough. Maybe we just haven't done it yet.
Yeah.
And it does seem like our rules get better as time goes on, right?
And I feel like just like the setup of like just looking at like temperance, it requires that there has to be one rule, like a rule, because anything that's not this one thing between between the excessive and the deficient is more towards one of those two sides. By having like two sides and looking for like the absolute middle, anything that's not that one thing, isn't it like more towards one of those sides?
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. So I
So
feel like that naturally means that like even if we don't know what it is, and even if we can never find what it is,
There is a
has to be
rule.
one thing. That
Yeah, it is.
only
That's-
that thing. Yeah.
Sure. But the question is like, can we sum it up in a rule that's going to work for every single instance? And they're like, ooh, that's going to be really, really tough. Impossible? Maybe that's too pessimistic. But maybe like difficult enough to say that like that shouldn't be our strategy. Maybe we shouldn't go after the rules. Yeah, Justin.
Did you say Kant answered that?
He offers an answer to it. I don't know if I would say that like, oh, Kant just makes this like, this is not a problem after Kant anymore. Kant gives us an alternative viewpoint that's like totally all about universal rules. You'll notice though that when it comes to like the absolute moral laws, like the perfect duties that Kant talks about and like the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, precious few of those. They don't cover like all of the oughts. They just cover our perfect duties, right? They just cover the sorts of things that would count as absolute laws. We have imperfect duties as well that are harder to describe. They're all kind of like aimed at this sort of thing. Where virtue might come like rushing back in. So yeah, we might say like Kant offers an answer, but it's maybe not enough to account for like all ethical action. So yeah, you guys are raising good responses about this. But we haven't seen this part of the response yet, which I think for me like this kind of sells it. The rules are impossible? I don't know, maybe that's just being pessimistic, but perhaps undesirable. When I think of somebody who acts well, when I think of somebody who is, maybe I want to be talking about somebody who's like a moral expert here. When I talk about somebody who's living life the way that it's supposed to be done, do I think of them as a rule follower? Let's make like a little bit of a Socratic move here. Let's make an analogy to technique. Let's make an analogy to like some other way of like doing things well. Let's think of like let's think of an athlete. Let's think of a baseball player who's like trying to hit a fastball. Anybody here play baseball? Nobody? Anybody here play golf? All right, we have a couple of people who swung a golf club before. How long have you been doing it for? 9 years? That's long enough. Derek, how long? About 5 years? Maybe long enough. When you guys first started out, were you thinking in terms of like rules? Were you thinking like, all right, left hand here, right hand here, make sure that like I get my elbow up on my backswing, like you were thinking about all the things that you needed to do? No, Derek's like, no, I just went out there and swung the club. Just try to hit the ball?
I had a coach.
You had a coach. And what did your coach gave you a whole bunch of rules to follow?
Lots of rules.
Yeah. Do you still think in terms of those rules?
Kind of secondhand now.
Yeah. What about, like, I know we've got at least 2 violin players. Other musicians? Anybody here play a musical instrument for long enough? And, like, maybe you were trained, you, like, took lessons in something, and at first they gave you rules? You put your fingers on the keyboard, like, make sure your wrists are up so that you can have, like, a nice arch to your fingertips. Like, hit that key when you want a D, like, when that note is on the page, you push that key or something like that, or, like, whenever somebody plays this chord, you want to like augment it with this note to make it sound this way. All these rules that are going on ahead. If you're a drummer, it's kind of like, all right, count out the beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is how people start out. rules are the training wheels version of doing something right. If we're thinking about somebody who, if we're thinking of like a John Coltrane, if we're thinking of like a Ken Griffey Jr. or something like that, if we're thinking about somebody who's doing it right, we might wonder, like, are they thinking about rules? Are they kind of like working this out in their head about like, all right, so what's the right thing to do in this situation? All right, I'll follow this rule. Or do we think that they've left the rules behind? We're going to follow the great American cinematic classic Top Gun. When Tom Cruise's character gets asked, like, what were you thinking when you were up there? He says, you can't think up there. Think. You're dead. This is true for fighter pilots, perhaps. Would we say that this is true in like all situations where people can do things really, really well? Where people can be, the word that we might be looking at here is like virtuosic. Is a virtuosic musician somebody who thinks in terms of rules? Or do they just play? They just see what needs to be done and they do it. Yeah.
I was kind of thinking my experience with talking to jazz saxophones. One of our saxophones.
You mean people who play the jazz saxophone, not actual jazz saxophones?
Yeah.
Okay, got it.
Because one of our guys at UNCG actually goes, they only take one saxophone a year, and they took our guy for Juilliard.
Oh, wow.
So, now he talked about like they can break down all the music theory, everything that's happening, but they say like once you get really good, you just think of how it sounds in your head, and then it just goes.
You leave
through.
all the rules behind, right?
So they can like, they could write down the rules, but they're not thinking about what they're playing.
But it actually doesn't describe the way that like they're working when they're doing it well. And in fact, we might say that this is what's necessary to really do it the right way, the right action at the right time with the right object, the right feeling especially. That it might be the sort of thing where like you're not thinking in terms of rules if you're doing it the right way. I can't imagine some funk drummer finding a groove by counting it out in their head. It's the sort of thing that like you gotta feel. The counting part is like maybe that sort of gets you there. But eventually you gotta leave that behind in order to do it the right way. Same sort of thing with like hitting a fastball or like any sort of thing that you can do really, really well. The rules are there to get you started. But if your head's full of all of these rules when you're supposed to be acting, it's not gonna work out. You're not gonna be able to do it well. Which suggests that this is the undesirable part of this. Not just that the rules are impossible to come up with, but even if they were, that wouldn't be the way that good people acted. The way that good people acted would be as moral experts, as virtuosos, as folks who just kind of like, they see what needs to be done, and they just do it, instead of thinking through it like very, very heavily. We're going to complicate that in just a second, but yeah, sure.
But isn't that exactly how they do it? Like you were saying with like a piano, like you're thinking about the rules, like keep your hands arched. People do keep their hands arched when they're amazing. They're still following that rule. It's just not.
But they're not. It's not conscious,
like,
right? Yeah.
I don't know who said it about like the golfing. It's secondhand. Those rules are still there and they're being followed. It's again, it's not conscious.
Yeah, but if it's unconscious, then.
But they're being followed.
Well, we might also kind of recognize that, like, one of the reasons. So one of the issues is that they become unconscious in order for you to like perform virtuously, right? The other thing might be that we recognize that the rules need to be broken in order for things to be done well.
I don't know. I feel like a great piano player still arches their hands.
Oh, yeah, really? Well, check out Thelonious Monk.
Oh.
But then maybe he could have been better if he did. But there are questions, and we might say that like a really good piano player like knows like how do they know? It's almost like their body knows, right? They kind of recognize there's a time to follow the rule, there's a time to break the rule. This is something that's evident in writing an awful lot. Like you've all been taught like 5-paragraph essay, like all these rules for writing. Good writers understand those rules, but they also see like when it's time to break those rules. They see when we've encountered the exception to the rule. And maybe they understand this intuitively. Maybe this is what we expect out of a moral expert. Somebody who has kind of gone beyond the rules. If we want to, Nietzsche would say, beyond good and evil, right? They kind of become the author of their own rules. Yeah.
And definitely with teaching pedagogy, I know that you teach all the students and whatnot to play the same way. Everyone sort of having the same form and whatnot. It's only once, like, say someone's been playing for like 10 or 20 years and they're like, actually, this is more comfortable. You'll see lots of professional musicians that just do like really funky looking things that just seem wrong.
Yeah.
But then they still play very well and do everything right. It just
But
doesn't
it works for them.
follow the rules.
Right. Yeah. Doesn't necessarily follow the rules. And that's the thing that you gain license to do that once you've mastered the rules, right? And this idea that, like, if you're still kind of stuck in rule following, then maybe we would say, like, you're not at virtue just yet. If you have to, like, work through rule following in order to get yourself to do the right thing, maybe it's not done with the right feeling. Maybe it's not done the way that the virtuous person does it. Maybe there's still a little bit of conflict within your soul if it doesn't flow completely naturally from you. Yes?
Oh, I was gonna say.
Oh, you were? Okay. Sorry, I interrupted. Yeah.
Like with golf, you were saying, I mean, we're still following the rules like later, but if you told someone never picked up a golf before, every single rule followed and they hit it, and if they hit it perfectly, they would play 18 holes like that though. Without
Yeah, maybe.
Without taking like 24 hours. It's just like
Because it would take them so long to, like, get everything just so.
Yeah, everything like, and then like when you break the rules, like there's that one really famous time when Tiger Woods broke his golf with one tree. It's just where his ball was sitting.
Yep.
That's a pretty good rule to not swing your golf with a tree. So
Yeah, I think that kind of summarizes the whole thing, right? When you learn the rules for how to hit a golf ball, nobody's thinking like, oh, and this is what you do when the ball is like nestled in the root of a tree.
yeah.
Like nobody has any idea like how to encounter that sort of thing. And then like one day it happens, right? And you're just like, ah, shit, what do I do now? You have to be a little bit creative. You realize that the rules have kind of, they don't cover all of the possible cases. They cover the normal cases, which is typically even good rules. They cover the normal cases. We're trying to figure out like, yeah, but what about the abnormal ones? And the virtue ethicist response to this is just to say that like, rules are only a start. What you want to do is get beyond rules. That's one possible criticism of virtue ethics. It doesn't give us any good abstract prescriptive rules for what right action is. And we have a couple of responses to this from the virtue ethicists. Another possible objection might have to do with this question of what do we do about conflicting virtues? Like, for example, friendliness seems like it's a virtue. If somebody's an asshole, it's going to be hard to think of them as like a good, excellent person. Honesty is a virtue. You ever been in a situation where, like, you have a friend who kind of asks you point blank about something? They're just kind of like, I don't know. Hey, you know, I've noticed like people have been kind of avoiding me lately. Like, they don't seem to like it. Like, whenever I walk into a room, everybody leaves. Like, what's going on there? And like, you know, it's like it's because your butt smells, and everybody thinks you're a jerk. Two separate things, not because of each other. Should you tell your friend this? Is it the friendly thing to do? Is it the honest thing to do? And we might think to ourselves, like, the friendly thing to do is to not hurt their feelings. The honest thing to do is to tell the truth. But if I tell the truth, I'm going to hurt their feelings. If I spare their feelings, I'm not going to tell the truth. I can't be both honest and friendly at the same time. What if we have conflicting virtues? What is it that I'm supposed to do? I get the sense that you guys can probably offer the response on your own. What is the response to this? Ooh. Make it, just pick one? Just pick one. Just either be friendly or be honest. Sometimes people will go the friendly route, sometimes, yeah.
I think you have to weigh the pros and cons. So, okay, yeah, you might hurt their feelings, but is you hurting their feelings going to be more of like a discomfort to them than letting them walk around smelling bad? Or is it going to be the opposite? They just kind of like, they'll probably go home and shower today anyway, should I just leave it alone and just let them?
You think it's going to kind of fix itself? Just kind of maybe don't say anything at all? Because it didn't need to be said,
Yeah.
right? And keep in mind, like, is honesty always telling the truth? You can be too blunt, you can be too tactless, and maybe we can talk about, like, there's a right way to tell the truth as well, right? Is friendliness always doing the thing that spares your friend's feelings?
No. You're going to help them too.
Is there an excess of niceness that actually misses friendliness?
Yes.
Do you know people who are like this?
Yes.
What kind of words do we use for this? Like, yeah, fake, sycophantic, obsequious, like all the big $20 words. Yeah. Big GRE words. Maybe our response here is like, if you understand the virtues properly, no conflict. No conflict. No conflict. You're the conflict. There is no conflict between these virtues if you understand them properly. Friendliness needs to be honest, right? No such thing as being a good friend if you're not an honest friend. And we got to keep in mind here that being honest isn't always telling the truth. When you do tell the truth, you should always do it in a friendly way. To not tell the truth in a friendly way would start to fall prey to some of these vices associated with truth-telling, right? You might be too blunt. You might be tactless. To actually be honest is to tell the truth in friendly ways. To actually be friendly is to be an honest person. And when we start thinking about like all these ways in which, like, well, why wouldn't I be honest with a friend? Why would you withhold the truth from a friend? Is it because you're afraid they won't like you anymore if you tell them difficult truths? You like the relationship as it is and you don't want to mess it up, you don't want it to change, you're afraid that it might change? Is it possible that fear is influencing your decision about like how you're going to try to be friendly or how you're going to try to be honest or truthful? Is it possible that desire is getting into it? That like maybe I like desire something from this person and so I'm not going to be entirely honest or I'm not going to be entirely friendly with them. I don't have their best interests at heart because I'm trying to get something. There are means to my own ends. It's not just that there's no conflict, but we might find, and Aristotle, and this is like maybe one of those things that is true of virtue ethics in general. There's certainly some debate about this, but for Aristotle, it's pretty clear where he falls on this. We have a certain holism about virtue. It's not just that the virtues don't conflict, it's that we need them all in order to get any one of them just so. In order to be a temperate person, you have to also be a courageous person. In order to be an honest person, you have to also be temperate and courageous. And you have to be, like, there's no way to have any one of the virtues perfectly without having all of the virtues. It's an all or nothing affair. This is what we mean by virtue holism. And it's not just that the virtues don't conflict, but that you need to have complete virtue to get any one particular virtue down just pat. Which makes this seem like an impossible task, right? Like, who could ever possibly do this? And again, we might say, like, it's not supposed to be an attainable goal. It's supposed to be a target that you're aiming at. It's a lifelong project, right? To try to habituate these character traits. Yeah, Francesca.
How many are there? How many virtues?
How many virtues?
Yeah.
A different virtue for every person in every season. Virtue is said in many ways. As many as you like, right? And in fact, or maybe just one, there's just whole virtue, and these are all the different faces of it.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of almost doesn't matter. Like, we're separating them in speech. Yeah, there's no... Aristotle wasn't quite so bold or foolish as to say, like, here's a definitive list of all the virtues. He does that with some other things. He'll say, like, here are all the possible logical categories. Kant will come along and do the same thing. Here are all the possible logical categories. And you're just like, 12. Exactly 12? That's how many there's going to be? All right, if you say so. I really wanted about 10 more minutes to talk about this. We've got about 10 minutes now. Let's get into this question of responsibility. We should talk a little bit about this because it's your new reflection prompt, right? It's about virtue and responsibility. Are we responsible for whether we're virtuous or vicious? Are we responsible for the things that we do? It seems that trying to sort out like responsibility, or if we want to get kind of maybe a little more precise about what I mean when I talk about responsibility. Specifically, we're talking about moral responsibility here. What is praiseworthy? What is blameworthy? When am I praiseworthy or blameworthy for an action? And how do I know? Aristotle identifies that, like, you're only going to be praised or blameworthy for something if you are in fact responsible, right? If when we were looking for the cause of the action, we said the action's cause was within you. So for example, if I'm just kind of like waving my hand right here, and we're like, what made me wave my hand right there? Like, what made me do this? And you're like, you did. The cause of the action is within you. Like, okay, I'm responsible. If this was a praise or blameworthy action, then we would say that, like, yeah, I'm responsible for it. I can be praised or blamed for it. On the other hand, if I had, say, like an older brother, and he, like, grabbed my hand and he was like, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself, stop hitting yourself, something like that. Where's the cause of that action? Is it within me?
No.
No, it's outside of me. And so, like, right off the bat, we could say something like, yeah, you're not responsible for this. You're not praised or blameworthy for something that somebody else forces you to do. Clearly, there's some difference between being responsible for, between an action being what we would say is voluntary or involuntary. And there are some obvious cases for, like, the difference between voluntary and involuntary. This is voluntary. This is involuntary. Everybody okay with that so far? What about the weird middle grounds, though? What about if you just told me, like, hey, slap your face, and I did it? Where's the cause of the action?
You.
Yeah, but you told me to slap my face, too, so it's at least partially outside of me.
You didn't have to do it.
So would you say that that's voluntary? If you say slap your face and I slap my face, we'd be like, that was voluntary.
Yeah, it was.
Well,
Yeah.
I could threaten you.
Yeah, so let's make it a little more textured. Let's say you pull out a gun and put it to my head and say, slap your face or I'm going to shoot you in the head. Choice is technically mine. Would we call it a voluntary act?
No, because
He slapped his face, and we were like, oh, he totally voluntarily did it. And like praise or like, and let's make it different. Let's say somebody holds a gun to my head and says, murder these people, or I'll put a bullet in your head. Would we say that, like, when I murdered the person and I went on trial for it, what would we say about whether or not that action was voluntary or involuntary?
Involuntary.
And how do we make up our minds about these kind of mixed actions, as Aristotle calls them? A little bit of voluntariness, a little bit of involuntariness. Some of these things are excusable. We might recognize, and this is an important category. I think this is a really important category for like everybody to recognize. This is something that exists. There are actions that I think we would say like, that was wrong, but I totally understand, like it's so understandable that somebody did the wrong thing. In which case we would say something like, the action itself might be praise or blameworthy, but we're not going to harangue the person who did it too terribly for having done it. There are some like impossible choices that sometimes people are put in. The best that we could say is kind of like, that action was bad but excusable. This is what excusable means, right? Excusable means it was bad, but we're not going to hold you responsible for it. Or we might say that like, that was a situation that nobody really should have had to have been in. You did your best. I'm sorry that you had to make that choice. We're not even going to get into whether it was the right or the wrong choice, just because all the options were so terrible. Yeah.
The difference when Aristotle was talking about non-voluntary and involuntary, what's
Yeah, so then we have this third category that he talks about where he talks about non-voluntary actions, right? So what's going on with non-voluntary actions? Maybe we put that into the mix too soon. Have we figured out the difference between voluntary and involuntary? It starts out with this question of like, what's the source of the action? Is it within or is it without? And then we were like, yeah, but sometimes it's mixed. What do we do in those situations where it's mixed? And Aristotle says, well, one of the things that we can do here, let's get rid of non-voluntary just for a second. So, location of the action. What is the source? What location of the source or the cause of the action? That's one way to determine it. But we have this problem with mixed actions, in which case Aristotle directs us to look at the feelings. Look at the feeling that's associated with this action. Is it a feeling, and maybe it's the feeling that comes after having done the action? Is this a situation where after having done the action, the agent feels regret, or do they feel relief? This is an interesting approach to this problem because we've kind of already opened the door to this prospect that, like, maybe I don't actually have that much control over my actions. Maybe if I'm talking about like my actions kind of flowing from my character, about like all these aspects of my irrational soul that determine like how I act, and even if I was to try to like overcome those predispositions with the strength of my will or something like that, it still wouldn't quite be virtuous. I'd still be missing the mark because I wouldn't be doing the action with the right feeling. Am I responsible for any of these things? How does my character come to be in the first place? Aren't I raised by other people?
And your genes and stuff like that.
Yeah, I've got like this complex combination of nature and nurture that turns me into the sort of person that I am. When does my own responsibility actually enter into this? And one of the ways that I can address this, without getting into like whether or not there is such a thing as free will, because this is the problem that's on the table here in Book 3 of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. We have a big metaphysical problem of like free will versus determinism. Free will versus determinism, and what can we say about responsibility within this question? And Aristotle does a really, really slick thing. He just kind of like, whoop, he swerves around the whole thing. And he says, it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter if all of our actions are determined. Because at the very least, I can look at the feeling that's associated with this. John Locke does a similar sort of thing. You can think of it in terms of like, I don't know. Let's say you're floating down a river, and the current is going this way, and it's going really, really strong down this branch of the river. There's another branch that kind of goes off, and like it's another path that you could take. And as you're floating down the river, maybe in an inner tube or something like that, as you're floating down the river, you really have no choice. The current is so strong that you're going to go down this branch. It's determined. You have no actual choice in the matter, I suppose. You can't change the future. You're definitely going down this branch. But you could do it willingly or unwillingly, right? You could try to fight it. You could be unhappy about it. You could be going down this route and be saying to yourself, like, I don't want to, I want to go the other way. Or you could be going down that route and being like, cool, this is exactly what I want. And Aristotle says, like, this alone is a way to talk about whether or not an action is voluntary or involuntary. It doesn't necessarily need to be changeable for us to say that somebody is praise or blameworthy for it. If you're doing the right thing and you're doing it voluntarily, you're doing it with the right feelings, then maybe that's something that we want to praise. There's so much more to say about this, and I guess I'm just going to save it for Thursday, right? All right. Keep your eyes peeled. There's going to be exam 2 being posted as soon as I can, hopefully by the end of the day. And you'll have a week to do it. It'll be a take-home exam just like the last one. All right.